My name is Nina, and at 35 years old, I stood by the exit doors of a sweltering high school auditorium holding a gold foil ticket while my ex-husband and his new wife occupied my VIP seats. His new wife laughed in my face, telling me the real family belonged in the front row and that I could watch my own son graduate from the back. She had no idea that my silence was not surrender. It was a countdown. Because when my son, the valedictorian, stepped up to the podium, he did not read his approved speech. He ripped it in half, pointed directly at his stepmother, and delivered a truth that would destroy their perfect lives forever. Before I tell you exactly what he said, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe true power is silent until the perfect moment strikes. The gold foil ticket felt unusually heavy between my fingers as I stepped through the auditorium doors. Row a seat 12 was printed in black beneath the school crest, and the principal had mailed it to me with a handwritten note thanking me for supporting the class valedictorian. I had arrived 40 minutes early because I wanted nothing to interfere with Caleb's day. I had pressed my navy dress before sunrise, checked the ticket 3 times, and carried the small camera he had given me for my birthday. For 18 years, I had watched every milestone from whatever corner I could afford. Today, for once, the school had placed me exactly where a mother belonged. The gymnasium was already crowded and brutally hot. Folding chairs covered the polished floor, in precise rows separated by velvet ropes that marked the reserved family section. Volunteers in blue polo shirts directed parents toward numbered seats, while the concert band tuned beneath the stage. I followed the signs to the front, smiling at families arranging bouquets and balloons. Each step brought the podium into clearer view. Caleb would stand there in less than an hour, gold cords around his neck speaking for the entire graduating class. I imagined him finding my face in the audience and seeing me in the seat he had earned for me. Then I reached row A. Lexi was sitting in seat 12. She wore a fitted white designer suit that looked chosen for photographs rather than a humid school gym. Her legs were crossed toward the aisle, and one jeweled heel swung lazily above the floor. My seat number was visible beneath her chair. The chair beside her held a structured leather handbag large enough to occupy its own place. Greg sat on the other side of that bag, in a gray tailored suit, staring at his phone. He did not look surprised to see me. That told me the theft of my seat was not an accident. I stopped beside Lexi and held out the ticket. "Excuse me, I believe you are in seat 12? Lexi looked at the ticket, then slowly lifted her eyes to my face. Her smile widened with the bright cruelty of someone who had been waiting for an audience. Several parents in the second row turned toward us. A volunteer holding a clipboard paused at the end of the aisle, uncertain whether to intervene. "Oh, please," Lexi said. She did not lower her voice. "The real family is sitting in the front row." She patted the handbag beside her as if it were more deserving of space than I was. "His mom can watch from the back. You are used to being in the background anyway, right?" A few people looked away in embarrassment. Others watched openly. I felt heat rise beneath my collar, but I kept my ticket steady. "That seat was assigned to me because Caleb is the valedictorian. You have your own guest ticket." Lexi laughed. It was a clean, practiced laugh, meant to make my request sound ridiculous. "My ticket is somewhere in my purse. Greg and I need to sit together for the family pictures. Caleb wants the people who supported him closest to the stage." Greg's thumb continued moving across his phone. I turned toward him. "Greg, tell her to move." For 1 second, his eyes lifted. There was no confusion in them, only irritation that I had forced him to acknowledge the problem. He glanced around at the parents watching, then leaned closer without standing. "Do not cause a scene, Nina," he muttered. "You will embarrass the family." The words were so familiar that they almost carried me backward in time. During our marriage, Every objection had become a scene, every boundary an embarrassment, every request for responsibility an attack on him. When he missed Caleb's pediatric appointments, I was dramatic. When the child support stopped, I was bitter. When I asked why his new car cost more than a year of tuition, I was jealous. Greg had survived by making my reaction look worse than his behavior. "I am holding the assigned ticket," I said. "She is sitting in my seat." Greg sighed as though I were delaying an important meeting. "There are empty chairs in the back. Sit there and let Caleb enjoy his graduation. For once, make the day about him instead of yourself." Lexi's smile sharpened. She raised her phone and angled the camera toward herself, checking how the stage appeared behind her. "See, this is perfect. The lighting from the back would wash me out." That small comment clarified everything. This was never about Caleb's comfort. It was about the photograph Lexi planned to post before the ceremony ended. She wanted the front row, the gold cords in the background, and a caption about how proud she was of the brilliant boy she barely knew. Greg wanted the same performance because important clients and country club friends were seated nearby. They had turned my son's achievement into a set, and I was the inconvenient person they needed outside the frame. The volunteer finally approached. She was a nervous senior with a laminated staff badge and a clipboard pressed to her chest. "Ma'am, the ticket numbers are assigned. We can help locate your correct seat." Lexi did not even look at her. "This is a private family matter." Greg slipped his phone into his jacket and gave the girl the polished smile he used with assistance. "It is fine. My former wife agreed to sit elsewhere." "I did not agree," I said. The volunteer looked at me apologetically. I could have insisted. I could have asked for the principal held up the ticket and forced Lexi out while hundreds of guests recorded the confrontation. The rules were on my side. But I saw what Greg wanted. He wanted footage of me arguing in the aisle so he could tell Caleb that his mother had disrupted the most important ceremony of his life. Lexi wanted tears shouting or security dragging someone away. They had prepared a trap around a folding chair. I folded the ticket once and placed it inside my purse. Lexi mistook the movement for defeat. "That is better," she said softly. "Try not to look so miserable in the background. Caleb will see the pictures later." I looked at Greg. He had already returned to his screen. Neither of them understood that silence could be a decision rather than a surrender. I had spent years learning how to examine false ledgers without warning the person who created them. I knew the value of allowing arrogant people to continue when they believed no one would challenge them. Today, I would not rescue Greg and Lexi from the consequences of being exactly who they were. "Enjoy the seat," I said. I turned and walked away before either of them could answer. The aisle seemed much longer in the opposite direction. I passed rows of parents who pretended not to have heard, though their expressions followed me. Near the back, the air was hotter and the view narrower, but the heavy metal exit doors gave me a place to stand without blocking anyone. I positioned myself beneath the red exit sign, straightened my shoulders, and looked toward the stage. The gold ticket remained in my purse as proof. I did not know what Caleb would see when he searched for me, but I knew he would recognize the truth immediately, without any explanation. I stood with my back pressed against the painted cinder block of the gymnasium wall. From my vantage point by the heavy exit doors, I had a perfect view of the auditorium. The front row was a sea of pastel summer dresses and tailored suits, but my eyes remained fixed on the stark white fabric of Lex's designer outfit. She was patting the expensive handbag that sat like a trophy on my designated seat. Greg remained beside her, completely absorbed in his smartphone, as if the surrounding celebration was a minor inconvenience. They looked incredibly comfortable in their stolen spotlight. A younger version of myself might have crumbled under that humiliation. I might have retreated to the parking lot to cry in my car, or caused the scene they secretly hoped for. But I had learned that the most effective response to arrogance is quiet observation. I took a breath of the humid air. The scent of cheap hairspray mixed with floral perfumes drifted through the gymnasium, creating an atmosphere that felt both festive and suffocating. Just a few feet away, a small cluster of women had gathered near the entrance. I recognized them immediately as the core members of the Prep School Parent-Teacher Association. At the center stood Susan, a woman whose highlighted hair and sharp features defined the country club aesthetic. Susan was speaking in a whisper specifically designed to be overheard. She held a graduation program like a fan, pointing discreetly toward the front row. I shifted my weight slightly, allowing myself to tune into their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. Susan was gushing about Lexi, praising the pristine white suit and the generosity of the woman. I listened quietly as Susan confidently informed the other mothers that Caleb was lucky to have such a devoted stepmother in his life. She spun a fabricated tale about how Lexi and Greg had stepped in to completely fund Caleb's elite prep school tuition, ensuring the boy had a solid foundation for his Ivy League future. Another mother nodded sympathetically, adding how incredibly difficult it must be for Greg to carry the entire financial burden of raising a gifted child while dealing with an absent ex-wife who contributed nothing to his success. They painted a vivid picture of Greg as a heroic provider, and Lexi as the gracious savior who had swooped in to rescue a bright young man from a life of absolute mediocrity. The lies were so polished and effortlessly delivered that they almost sounded like the truth. For 18 long years, I had allowed Greg to dictate and control the narrative. I had kept my head down and my mouth shut, believing, foolishly, that my hard work would eventually speak for itself. I had swallowed my pride repeatedly to maintain peace, while Greg and Lexi built an entire social empire on the hidden foundation of my silent, unseen sacrifices. But today was different. Today I was done being the invisible ghost in my son's life story. I stepped away from the wall and closed the short distance between myself and the gossiping mothers. I moved, deliberately inserting myself right beside Susan, just as she was praising Lex's latest philanthropic donation. The women turned to look at me, their expressions shifting rapidly from polite curiosity to mild confusion as they took in my simple navy dress and worn shoes. I did not raise my voice or show any anger. I did not sound bitter or defensive. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out my wallet. I opened it carefully and slid out a small rectangular piece of plastic. It was a faded, cracked diner name tag with the word Nina printed in peeling black letters. The edges were permanently stained with old fry grease that no amount of scrubbing had ever been able to remove. I held it out steady in the humid air so Susan and her friends could see it clearly. I introduced myself with a warm, polite smile, stating that I was Caleb's mother. I told them it was wonderful to finally put faces to the names Caleb had mentioned over the past 4 years. Then I looked directly into Susan's shocked eyes and began to dismantle her carefully constructed fairy tale. I kept my tone entirely conversational. I explained gently that I had given birth to Caleb when I was 17 and terrified. I told them exactly how Greg had walked out right after Caleb's 3rd birthday because he abruptly decided he was simply not ready for the burden of fatherhood. The women stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sudden injection of unfiltered truth into their polite society bubble. I pointed to the grease-stained name tag resting in my palm. I explained that this cheap piece of plastic was how Caleb's elite prep school tuition was actually funded every single semester. I told them about the 5 years of grueling graveyard shifts I worked at a 24-hour diner, pouring endless cups of coffee and scrubbing sticky tables until my hands bled, just to afford his middle school textbooks. I described the double shifts I took on later, working 60 hours a week as a junior bookkeeping clerk, meticulously crunching numbers in a windowless back office so Caleb could have a reliable laptop and a safe, quiet place to sleep. Susan tried to stammer out an apology, her face flushing a mottled red, but I simply smiled reassuringly and kept speaking. I delivered the final piece of reality with absolute calm precision. I informed them that despite the imported cars and the custom-tailored designer suits, Greg had not paid a single dime in child support in over a decade. He had hidden his corporate assets perfectly, while I actively chose to buy cheap instant noodles for my own dinners so Caleb could eat fresh vegetables and protein. Lexi did not fund my son's education, I told them, my voice ringing with quiet, undeniable authority. Lexi simply bought the right to sit in the front row, using the money her husband saved by abandoning his only child. The tight circle of wealthy mothers stood in absolute stunned silence. The pristine, carefully curated illusion had been shattered entirely. Whispers spread rapidly outward, traveling down the crowded aisles like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Lexi felt the shift immediately. She turned around, her eyes scanning the sea of faces until they locked directly onto mine. The flawless, confident facade cracked, exposing the insecure woman underneath. She glared at me and mouthed threats. The grand chords of the traditional graduation march suddenly echoed through the speakers overhead. The swelling music drowned out whatever vicious words Lexi was trying to hurl across the gymnasium. The PTA mothers, who had just heard the absolute truth about my life, immediately scattered. They hurried back to their respective seats, casting nervous sideways glances at the front row where Lexi was now visibly seething. Her image had cracked, and the panic in her eyes was obvious. I leaned back against the cinder block of the exit wall, crossing my arms and taking a steady breath. The metal doors behind me provided a solid anchor as the entire auditorium shifted its attention to the back of the room. The monumental moment we had all been waiting for was finally starting. The double doors at the far end of the gymnasium swung wide open, and the graduating class began their procession down the center aisle. A sea of bright blue and white gowns flooded the walkway. The students marched in perfect pairs, their faces flushed with a mixture of summer heat and overwhelming excitement. Parents all around me stood up on their toes, holding up their smartphones and cameras, desperate to capture a glimpse of their children. The air crackled with the kind of electric energy that only comes from years of hard work finally reaching its conclusion. I watched the procession with a lump forming in my throat. I was not looking at a crowd of young adults. I was searching the lines for one specific face. And then I saw him. Caleb walked near the very end of the line, standing tall and confident. He wore the traditional blue cap and gown, but draped proudly around his neck were the heavy gold cords signifying his status as valedictorian. He looked incredibly handsome, and so incredibly grown up. My heart swelled with a pride that made my eyes burn with unshed tears. I remembered the tiny boy who used to fall asleep on a pile of coats in the back booth of the diner while I worked the overnight shift. I remembered the teenager who taught himself coding on a refurbished laptop sitting at our small kitchen table while I balanced accounting ledgers late into the night. Now, he was a brilliant young man walking toward a future that we had built together, piece by grueling piece. Caleb climbed the wooden stairs to the stage with the rest of the honor students, taking his designated seat in the front row facing the audience. The principal, a tall man with a commanding voice, stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. He welcomed the crowd, speaking eloquently about the challenges this particular class had overcome and the bright futures that awaited them. He spoke at length about the importance of family support, praising the parents in the room for their unwavering dedication and financial sacrifices. The irony of his words washed over me as I stood alone by the exit doors, but I maintained my expression. The audience cheered and applauded at all the right moments, but my attention remained entirely fixed on my son. Caleb was looking out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was looking for row A, seat 12. He was looking for the mother who had promised she would be sitting front and center to watch him deliver his speech. From my position at the back of the auditorium, I watched the exact moment Caleb's gaze landed on the VIP section. Even from a distance, I could see the subtle shift in his posture. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching the front row. He saw Greg sitting there in his tailored suit, clapping with the bored detachment of a man attending a mandatory corporate seminar. Then he saw Lexi, sitting in the seat right next to his father, occupying the exact spot that was supposed to belong to me. Lexi waved enthusiastically at the stage, holding up her smartphone to record a video for her social media followers. She flashed a smile for the camera, playing the role of the stepmother to absolute perfection. Caleb did not wave back. His hands gripped the armrests of his folding chair. I could see the confusion ripple across his face, quickly replaced by a dawning comprehension. He knew exactly what Lexi was capable of, and he knew exactly how much Greg hated confrontation. He understood the dynamic instantly. He realized that his mother had been pushed aside so his father's new wife could have a better angle for her photographs. Caleb tore his eyes away from the front row and began to scan the rest of the auditorium with determination. He looked past the velvet ropes, past the middle sections, and swept his gaze all the way to the back walls. I stepped slightly away from the shadows of the exit doors, moving into the light, so he could see me clearly. Our eyes met across the crowded gymnasium. In that split second, an entire silent conversation passed between us. He saw my simple navy blue dress. He saw me standing alone, leaning against the concrete wall, while other parents sat comfortably in their assigned chairs. The proud, happy smile that had illuminated his face just moments before vanished completely. It was wiped away, leaving behind a cold, resolute expression. His jaw clenched tight and his shoulders squared. My son was no longer just a graduating high school student participating in a ceremony. He was a young man who had just witnessed the ultimate disrespect directed at the one person who had sacrificed everything for his success, and he was absolutely furious. The principal concluded his opening remarks and turned toward the seated honor students. He spoke with pride as he introduced the class valedictorian, highlighting Caleb's grade point average, his work ethic, and his upcoming enrollment at an Ivy League university. The entire crowd erupted into very loud applause. Greg stood up in the front row, clapping vigorously, to ensure everyone around him saw the father supporting his son. Lexi clapped right beside him, capturing the standing ovation on her phone. Caleb stood up from his chair. He walked slowly and deliberately toward the wooden podium. The applause died down as he adjusted the microphone to his height. He reached inside the pocket of his graduation gown and pulled out several sheets of neatly folded paper. This was his official speech. The school administration had reviewed and approved every single word of it weeks ago. Lexi had even posted a brag on social media just yesterday, claiming she had spent hours helping him polish the final draft. Caleb unfolded the pages and smoothed them out on the podium. The entire auditorium waited in anticipation. He looked down at the approved words that were supposed to neatly wrap up his high school experience with gratitude. Then he slowly lifted his head. He did not look at the principal standing behind him. He did not look at his fellow classmates. He looked directly down at the center of the front row, locking his furious gaze completely on Lexi. The gymnasium was dead silent. Caleb picked up the stack of papers. Without breaking eye contact with his stepmother, he grasped the speech with both hands and ripped the pages perfectly in half. The tearing sound amplified through the microphone, echoing like a gunshot across the room. He dropped the torn pieces, allowing them to flutter down to the wooden floor of the stage like discarded trash. The torn halves of thick parchment paper hit the varnished wood of the stage with a soft slap. The microphone captured the sharp tearing sound and broadcast it across the sweltering gymnasium. But the silence that followed was suffocating. Thousands of people stopped fanning themselves with their programs. Parents lowered their cameras. The school principal, standing just a few feet behind my son, shifted his weight, clearly unsure if this was a dramatic pause. It was not a pause. It was a complete demolition of the script. Caleb leaned forward, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. His knuckles turned white under the harsh stage lights. He adjusted the microphone downward until it sat level with his mouth. "I was supposed to stand up here today and read a very specific speech," Caleb began, his voice echoing across the cavernous room. "I was supposed to talk about chasing our dreams and thanking the supportive family members who supposedly sat in the front row cheering us on." He paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "I submitted that speech to the administration 3 weeks ago. It was safe, it was polite, and it was a complete lie." A murmur rippled through the back sections of the bleachers, but the VIP seating area remained deathly still. I stood by the exit doors, my heart pounding fiercely against my ribs. Caleb did not break eye contact with the center of the front row. "The truth is, I cannot stand here and deliver a fabricated story about my supportive family. Not when the woman who actually gave me everything, who sacrificed every comfort she had so I could stand on this stage today, is currently standing all the way by the exit doors." He raised his hand and pointed a steady finger directly toward the back of the auditorium. Thousands of heads swiveled in unison. The collective gaze of the graduating class, the faculty, and the affluent parents landed squarely on me, standing alone in my simple navy blue dress against the concrete wall. I did not shrink back. I held my chin high and met my son's eyes across the vast expanse. For 18 long years, I had allowed Greg to control the false narrative, making me feel like an inadequate, invisible failure who could never possibly measure up to the impossible standards of his wealthy corporate lifestyle. Now my son was taking that narrative and dismantling it brick by brick in front of the very people Greg sought to impress. Caleb lowered his hand and redirected his intense focus back to the front row. "My mother is standing by the exit right now because my stepmother decided her designer handbag deserved a VIP seat more than the woman who actually broke her back raising me." The gasp that erupted from the audience was audible. It was a sharp, simultaneous intake of breath from hundreds of shocked parents. The atmosphere shifted from polite confusion to scandalized horror. The people sitting directly behind the VIP section leaned forward, their eyes darting to the white tailored suit and the expensive purse still occupying row A, seat 12. Lexi went completely pale. The smug, triumphant smirk she had worn like a crown just 20 minutes earlier dissolved into sheer panic. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking small and exposed under the glaring gymnasium lights. She shrank back into her folding chair instinctively, pulling her designer bag off the seat and clutching it to her chest like a protective shield. But it was far too late. The damage was done, and the entire community was now staring directly at her. Greg was no longer looking at his smartphone. His face flushed a dark, angry red, the color creeping up his neck and flooding his cheeks. He half stood from his chair, his corporate composure shattered. He shot a frantic glare up at the stage, furiously shaking his head and making a sharp cutting motion across his throat, signaling Caleb to stop speaking immediately. Caleb ignored his father completely. He reached out and unclipped the microphone from its stand, holding it firmly in his right hand. He stepped away from the wooden podium and walked to the very edge of the stage, closing the physical distance between himself and the VIP section. He looked down at Greg with an expression of pure disdain. "You cannot silence the truth just because it makes you look bad in front of your wealthy country club friends and important business partners," Caleb said, his voice ringing with undeniable authority. "I am the valedictorian of this class, and I earned the right to speak my mind today. So everyone is going to sit down and listen to exactly how I got here." He turned his attention back to Lexi, who was now visibly trembling in her seat. For the past 4 years, my stepmother has been posting perfectly filtered photos on social media, taking credit for every academic award, every test score, and every college acceptance letter I ever received. Just yesterday, she posted a lengthy status update bragging about how she spent hours helping me polish my graduation speech. Caleb laughed, a short, bitter sound that lacked any real humor. She did not write a single word of that speech. She did not even know what my major was until she read it on the graduation program this morning. Her entire involvement in my education consisted of blocking my mother's phone number so I could not call home when I needed lunch money. The whispers in the audience morphed into an audible buzz of outrage. Susan and the PTA mothers who heard my story before the ceremony were now actively glaring at Lexi, their expressions twisted with absolute disgust. The curated image Lexi spent years building was crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes. She looked frantically around the massive room, desperately seeking an ally, but found absolutely nothing except cold, judgmental stares. Caleb took another step along the edge of the stage, pacing slowly as he addressed the massive crowd. If you want to know who actually funded my elite prep school tuition, you should look at the woman standing by the doors. My mother worked graveyard shifts at a 24-hour diner, coming home smelling like fry grease, just in time to make me breakfast before school. While my father was upgrading his luxury vehicles, my mother was working double shifts as an accounting clerk. She stayed up until 3 in the morning, drilling me on advanced calculus because she knew education was my only way out. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. She ate instant noodles for 2 solid years, just so she could afford to buy me a functioning laptop for my coding classes. She wore the same winter coat for 5 seasons, so I could have a new suit for my debate tournaments. That is what actual parenting looks like. It is not about buying front-row tickets or posing for the perfect photograph. It is about bleeding for your child behind closed doors when no one else is watching. Caleb stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, looking straight at me across the vast auditorium. I did not get here because of the people sitting in the VIP section. I got here because Nina is the strongest, most resilient woman I have ever known. Thank you, Mom, for everything you have done. Caleb was not finished. He turned slightly toward the graduating class seated behind him, and the anger in his face softened into something more personal. Some of you know what it feels like to study while the adults in your life are fighting about money, he said. Some of you have pretended not to notice when a parent skips dinner or says a bill can wait. I noticed. I noticed everything. He described a winter during his sophomore year when a burst pipe had flooded the diner kitchen. The restaurant closed for 12 days, wiping out the overnight wages I depended on. I had told him the closure was a welcome break. He revealed that he had found me at the kitchen table after midnight, surrounded by utility notices and tuition invoices, calculating how many additional bookkeeping hours I could accept without missing his debate tournament. I had fallen asleep with a pencil in my hand. Caleb had quietly covered me with his coat before returning to his room. The next morning, she drove 3 hours through freezing rain to watch me lose in the first round, he said. A few students laughed gently, but his expression remained serious. She sat in the front row anyway. She never made love conditional on winning. My throat tightened. I had forgotten the coat, the rain, and the humiliating debate loss. Caleb had not. He spoke about the refurbished laptop. The machine had failed 2 weeks before a statewide coding competition, its screen turning black every time he compiled the final program. Greg had promised to replace it, then stopped answering messages after Caleb refused to spend the competition weekend at a resort with Lexi's friends. I had taken the broken computer to 3 repair shops. When each estimate exceeded what I had left after rent, I sold the only piece of jewelry my grandmother had given me. A small gold bracelet, hidden for years in a kitchen drawer. Mom told me the bracelet had been lost, Caleb said. I learned the truth when I found the pawn receipt inside a tax folder. She traded the last valuable thing she owned for a laptop so I could submit a program that earned my first scholarship interview. Caleb lifted the microphone again. My mother did not simply quiz me on calculus. She learned calculus again because I needed help. She watched free lectures during her meal breaks, wrote formulas on diner order pads, and asked my teacher for practice problems without telling me. The night before my final exam, she worked 14 hours, came home with swollen feet, and stayed awake until I could solve every problem without looking at the answer key. A low sound moved through the audience, not applause yet, but recognition. The story was no longer about one stolen seat. It was about the invisible labor people accepted while celebrating those who arrived only for photographs. Caleb looked down at Greg. My father likes to describe money as proof that he provided, but promises are not payments. A car parked outside a large house does not help a child when the tuition portal closes at midnight. A social media post does not replace a parent sitting beside you when you are terrified you will fail. Greg raised one hand as if he might interrupt, but the parents closest to him turned with such visible disgust that he lowered it. Lexi stared at the floor. Her phone was still recording, though she no longer seemed aware of it. Caleb then told the story I most wished he had never discovered. During junior year, an emergency restructuring project kept me away from home from dawn until late evening. The overtime covered his advanced placement fees and a summer program deposit. I packed 2 lunches each morning, claiming one was mine, then carried it home untouched, so he would believe we had enough food. I found 8 untouched lunches in the freezer, he said. His voice broke for the first time. She was eating crackers from the office break room while telling me she had already eaten. When I confronted her, she apologized to me. She apologized because she thought knowing the truth would distract me from studying. My eyes filled. I pressed my fingertips against my lips, unable to hide the tears now. Across the auditorium, Caleb saw them and steadied himself. That is the difference between sacrifice and performance, he continued. Performance demands an audience. Sacrifice happens when nobody is watching, and the person making it expects no reward. My mother never asked me to announce any of this. She actually asked me to keep the approved speech because she did not want conflict on my graduation day. That revelation turned the last uncertain faces against Greg and Lexi. Susan folded her arms. The volunteer who had watched Lexi refuse my ticket stood near the aisle with tears in her eyes. Even the principal's expression changed. He stopped glancing toward the audio booth and allowed Caleb to continue. I am not telling you these things because I want pity for us, Caleb said. I am telling you because people like my mother are erased when wealthier people repeat a lie often enough. They work the late shifts, sign the permission forms, repair the uniforms, answer the midnight calls, and then get told to stand in the back so someone else can look like a family. He turned fully toward me. Mom, every grade beneath my name carries part of your work. Every acceptance letter belongs partly to you. This diploma is not evidence that I escaped your life. It is evidence of what we built together. He placed one hand over the gold cords at his chest. They can keep the front row. They can keep the photographs and the stories they tell their friends. I know who raised me. I know who stayed, and I want everyone here to know it too. This diploma belongs to my mother as much as it belongs to me. The thunderous applause that followed his words did not start in the front rows. It began in the back of the gymnasium, where the regular family sat. Someone clapped, then another, and within seconds, the entire rear section was on its feet. The sound swelled and rolled forward, carrying a profound sense of validation that washed over me like a physical force. I pressed my hands against my mouth, fighting the tears streaming down my cheeks. For years, I had convinced myself that my sacrifices were invisible, that the late nights and financial panic were silent burdens I had to bear alone. Hearing my son acknowledge them, in front of the people who had looked down on me, shattered the invisible wall around my heart. I was no longer just the forgotten ex-wife standing in the shadows. I was the mother of the valedictorian, and the entire room was cheering for the truth. Down in the VIP section, the atmosphere was radically different. Lexi was crumbling under the weight of public exposure. She brought both hands up to cover her face, her makeup ruined by the panic and humiliation washing over her. She tried to slide down lower in her folding chair, wishing the wooden floor would simply open up and swallow her whole. The affluent mothers sitting behind her, who had been praising her generosity 30 minutes ago, were now glaring at the back of her head with undisguised contempt. Their whispered judgments were relentless. Lex's carefully curated socialite persona, the image she had spent years building on the foundation of my hard work, was entirely decimated. But Greg was not hiding. The applause ringing through the gymnasium acted as an accelerant to his mounting rage. He could not process the fact that his controlled narrative was being destroyed by his son. In Greg's mind, he was the successful corporate executive who deserved the front row seat and public admiration. He was incapable of handling the reality of being exposed as a fraud in front of his wealthy peers and business associates. His face was a mask of volatile fury, the dark red flush spreading to his hairline. He stood up abruptly, knocking his folding chair backwards so forcefully that it slammed into the knees of the woman sitting directly behind him. He did not turn to apologize. He did not look at his sobbing wife. His eyes were locked in a death stare directly on Caleb. Greg marched out of the VIP section and strode toward the wooden stairs leading up to the stage. His heavy footsteps echoed with aggressive intent. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the front rows as parents watched the angry father break ceremony protocol. The student ushers standing near the stairs stepped back, defensively intimidated by the sheer hostility radiating from his tense posture. Greg climbed the steps, taking them 2 at a time, his jaw clenched tight. The principal standing near the back of the stage took a hesitant step forward, raising his hand in a weak attempt to intervene and maintain order, but Greg shot him a look so threatening that the principal froze in place, completely unsure of how to de-escalate a domestic dispute playing out in the middle of a formal graduation ceremony. Caleb watched his father approach the podium. He did not flinch. He did not step back. He stood his ground with the quiet, steady strength of a young man who had spent his life watching his mother face down hardship without backing away. Greg reached the podium and immediately invaded Caleb's personal space. He leaned in close, his body language dominating and aggressive. He reached out and tightly grabbed Caleb's upper arm, his fingers digging fiercely into the dark blue fabric of the graduation gown. It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to force compliance through physical presence. Greg leaned his head forward, bringing his mouth mere inches from Caleb's ear. He intended to deliver a private, devastating threat meant to terrify his son back into submission. But in his blind, arrogant rage, he completely forgot about the sensitive, heavy metal microphone standing directly between them. "You are cut off," Greg whispered aggressively, his voice trembling with vicious anger. "I am pulling your college tuition today. You are getting nothing." The microphone caught every syllable. The audio system amplified Greg's harsh whisper and broadcast it clear across the entire sweltering gymnasium. The words bounced off the vaulted ceilings and slammed into the ears of every parent and faculty member in the room. The cheering and applause died, instantly replaced by a thick, horrified silence. The audience sat in absolute collective shock. They had just heard a grown man actively threaten to destroy his son's educational future simply because the boy had chosen to thank his mother on stage. The utter cruelty of the statement was staggering. The PTA mothers in the front rows gasped audibly, their hands flying to their mouths in disbelief. The illusion of the providing father was eradicated, leaving behind only the ugly reality of a controlling and vindictive man. Caleb looked down at his father's hand gripping his arm. Then he looked up into Greg's flushed, furious face. I expected to see anger in my son's eyes, or perhaps the lingering traces of childhood fear. Instead, I saw absolute pity. It was the look you give someone who is completely lost and entirely pathetic. Caleb calmly but firmly pulled his arm backward, breaking Greg's tight grip with a sudden, forceful motion. He stepped to the side, creating a clear boundary between them. He did not raise his voice or match his father's aggressive energy. He simply reached out and adjusted the microphone, pulling it a fraction of an inch closer to his own mouth. "Do not worry, Dad," Caleb said, his voice projecting a profound calm that resonated through the silent auditorium. "I am done playing this game with you, and by the way, you can stop threatening to pull my college fund." Caleb paused, letting his steady gaze bore directly into Greg's panicked eyes. He leaned just a little bit closer to the microphone, ensuring his final words would cut through the humid air with absolute, devastating clarity. "We both know it does not exist." The delivery was flawless. The revelation dropped over the audience like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Greg froze paralyzed in his tracks on the center of the wooden stage. The blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old under the glaring overhead lights. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The threat he had used for years to maintain control over us, to demand respect and enforce compliance, had been publicly exposed as a massive, pathetic lie in front of the entire community. A collective gasp of horror rolled through the vast crowd. The whispers that followed were sharp, angry, and entirely directed at the man standing frozen on the stage. People were openly expressing disgust, pointing at Greg and shaking their heads. The principal snapped out of his stunned paralysis and frantically signaled the audiovisual team in the back booth. A metallic click echoed through the speakers as the microphone was abruptly cut off, terminating the live audio feed. But the desperate action came far too late to save Greg's reputation. The damage was permanent and irreversible. The truth was out, and the stage was perfectly set for a massive, unhinged post-ceremony explosion. The immediate aftermath of the graduation ceremony was a scene of absolute chaos. As the final chords of the recessional music faded, the double doors of the gymnasium burst open, and a flood of overwhelmed parents and stunned students spilled out into the brightly lit main hallway. I did not wait for the crowd to swallow me. I moved purposefully, slipping through the heavy metal exit doors and finding a steady place to stand near a long row of blue metal lockers. I needed to wait for Caleb to emerge from the sea of blue and white gowns, but I also knew exactly what was coming next. Greg would come looking for me. I did not have to wait long. Lexi burst into the hallway first, and she was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The arrogant condescension she had proudly displayed in the front row was completely gone. In its place was a hysterical weeping victim. She was sobbing theatrical tears of absolute rage, her face buried in her hands as she dramatically leaned against the tiled wall. She was screaming loud enough for the entire echoing corridor to hear, complaining bitterly that her flawless reputation was completely ruined and that her affluent friends were openly laughing at her. I watched as the very women she had tried so hard to impress earlier actively averted their eyes and walked briskly past her. No one stopped to offer her a tissue. No one asked if she was all right. Her social isolation was instantaneous and brutal. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of lies, and now she was suffocating under the debris. Greg appeared moments later, pushing his way roughly through the crowded hallway. His expensive gray suit was rumpled, and his face was still flushed with a dangerous volatile red. He spotted me standing calmly by the lockers and marched directly toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing with aggressive intent. He did not care that there were dozens of families lingering nearby. He only cared about regaining control. He closed the distance between us and immediately invaded my personal space, trapping me against the cold metal of the lockers. He planted his hands on either side of my shoulders, boxing me in, trying to use his height and physical presence to intimidate me back into the fearful, submissive woman I used to be. "You planned this?" Greg hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You poisoned his mind. You weaponized my own son against me, just to ruin my corporate image." I did not shrink back. I did not avert my gaze. I stood perfectly still, looking directly into his furious eyes. "I planned nothing, Greg," I said, my voice low and unwavering. "Caleb is 18 years old. He has eyes and ears. He simply told the truth about what he has witnessed his entire life. You ruined your own image the moment you threatened his education on a live microphone." Greg leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "You think you won today, Nina? You think embarrassing me in front of my business partners makes you a hero? You are nothing. You are a bitter, lonely accountant who could not handle the fact that I moved on to a better life. I will make sure Caleb pays for this. I will make sure you both lose everything." I allowed him to throw his tantrum. I let him hurl his pathetic threats because I knew they were entirely empty. He was a cornered animal, lashing out blindly because his carefully constructed world was collapsing. I just smiled, a small, tight smile that only served to infuriate him further. Greg's eyes narrowed when he saw that I was not frightened. He shifted closer until the buttons of his jacket nearly touched my dress, trying to block my view of the hallway and everyone else's view of me. The old version of our marriage played out in his posture. He created pressure-limited space and then waited for me to apologize, simply to make the pressure stop. This time, I planted both feet and let the cold metal locker support my back. "Move away from me," I said. He gave a humorless smile. "Or what you will call one of your little bookkeeping friends." A father, standing nearby, lowered his phone and stepped half a pace toward us. Greg noticed and immediately changed his expression, smoothing his features into wounded concern. He turned just enough for the watching parents to see his profile. "I am trying to discuss our son's future with an unstable former spouse," he announced. "Please give us privacy." Greg released one hand from the metal and stepped back only a few inches. His jaw worked as he swallowed the insult. He hated witnesses he could not control. Lexi hurried toward us, her theatrical sobbing now sharpened into anger. Black mascara traced thin lines beneath her eyes. She pointed at me while speaking to Susan and the other parents, not to me. "She orchestrated everything. She has been jealous since Greg married me. She told Caleb to humiliate us because she cannot stand seeing a successful blended family." Susan looked at the designer handbag clutched beneath Lexi's arm. "Did she tell you to take the assigned seat, too?" Lexi froze. Several people laughed under their breath. The sound was small, but it cut through her performance more effectively than shouting. She wiped at her cheeks and tried another approach. "I thought the seats were flexible," she said. "Nina could have asked politely. Instead, she disappeared and made Caleb think we forced her away." The student volunteer from the auditorium stepped out of the crowd. Her clipboard was still pressed against her blue polo shirt. "She did ask politely," the girl said. "I offered to check the tickets. You said it was a private family matter, and Mr. Gregg told me Nina had agreed to move when she had not." Lexi stared at the teenager as though betrayal by a witness violated some unwritten rule. Greg's face darkened further. "This is none of your concern," he snapped. "It became our concern when you threatened a graduate on an open microphone," Susan replied. More phones appeared. Parents who had once accepted Greg's polished stories now recorded him with the same fascination they might have given a public accident. He looked from one lens to another and understood that intimidation would no longer remain behind closed doors. For a moment I believed he might leave. Then his pride overruled his judgment. He turned back to me. "Tell them the truth about the college fund," he demanded. "Tell them you have been draining Caleb's trust for years while blaming me." The accusation was so reckless that I almost admired it. Only 3 days earlier, Caleb and I had sat with the trust department after he signed written authorization allowing the bank to release the complete account history to both of us. The compliance officer had explained every transfer, every false education certification, and every payment routed to vendors connected to Greg. The certified packet in my purse was not a rumor or a private spreadsheet. It was the bank's own record prepared after an internal review initiated by the adult beneficiary. I did not reveal that yet. I simply asked, "Are you certain you want to discuss the trust fund in front of witnesses?" Greg's confidence flickered. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. So did Lexi. She turned toward him, her crying stopping abruptly. "What does she mean?" Lexi asked. "Nothing," Greg said too quickly. "She is bluffing." I reached into my purse only far enough to touch the corner of the bank envelope. Greg followed the movement. The veins at his temple began to pulse. A school security officer approached through the crowd. He was broad-shouldered, but calm, one hand resting near the radio clipped to his belt. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," Greg answered. "My former wife is creating drama at our son's graduation." The officer looked at the space between Greg and the lockers, then at the phone's recording. "Sir, I need you to step away from her." Greg obeyed, but only because Arthur Bennett, one of his company's junior investors, had appeared near the trophy case. Greg recognized him and immediately adjusted his tie. Even in a hallway filled with evidence of his cruelty, he remained more concerned about corporate perception than Caleb's pain. "Nina," Greg said in a lower voice, attempting negotiation now. "We can fix this before it spreads. Have Caleb post that his speech was emotional and that he misunderstood the seating. You can tell everyone the trust is delayed because of a banking error. I will release a statement praising you as a dedicated mother." I stared at him. "You are offering me a flattering lie in exchange for protecting a larger one." "I am offering you a way out," he insisted. "Think about what happens when people investigate you too. You work around confidential financial information. One complaint from me and your firm will suspend you before Monday." That threat might once have unsettled me. Now it exposed how little he knew. My firm maintained a strict ethics department precisely because our work could destroy powerful careers. Every document related to Greg's company had been obtained through authorized due diligence, reviewed by outside counsel, and preserved under formal chain of custody. I had recused myself from transaction testing because of our former marriage. A separate team had performed the fieldwork, and I had not touched the final conclusions until the engagement partner and legal counsel cleared the report. Greg could complain, but the complaint would direct investigators toward records he desperately wanted hidden. "Make the call," I said. "Use speakerphone." His lips parted, but no answer came. Lexi looked between us, realizing for the first time that his threats might be empty. "Greg, what is in the trust?" He ignored her. He pointed at me again, though. The security officer immediately ordered him to lower his hand. "You think your title makes you untouchable?" he said. "It does not change where you came from. Everyone here knows you were a teenage mother waiting tables." "Yes," I replied. "And Caleb just thanked me for surviving it. You are the only person who still believes honest work is shameful." The father who had stepped forward earlier nodded. Susan lowered her phone only long enough to say, "She has nothing to be ashamed of." Greg's control finally cracked. He began listing every favor his parents had ever claimed to provide, from birthday gifts to one summer camp fee, presenting occasional generosity as ownership of Caleb's future. Lexi interrupted to insist that she had bought graduation clothes, forgetting that I had the receipt in my purse. Their stories collided in public, each contradiction exposing another layer of the false family image. I remained silent and let them damage themselves. The security officer stayed close. The surrounding parents did not disperse. Greg's mouth opened again, ready to deliver another threat. Before Greg could escalate his verbal assault, the crowd parted again. Pushing their way through the throng of shocked parents were Richard and Patricia Greggs. Wealthy, status-obsessed parents, Richard was 65 years old, a man who had built his own successful real estate empire and believed that money excused all moral failings. Patricia was 62, draped in expensive jewelry and carrying a look of perpetual disdain. They had always treated me like a regrettable mistake, a poor girl who had temporarily tricked their promising son into a teenage pregnancy. They had spent years enabling Greg's worst behaviors, excusing his absence as a father and funding his lavish lifestyle, while completely ignoring their grandson's struggles. Richard marched right up to the lockers, aggressively inserting himself into the confrontation. He raised his hand and pointed a shaking, wrinkled finger directly at my face. His eyes were wide with indignation, furious that the family name had been dragged through the mud on a public stage. "You always were bitter, Nina." Richard spat, his voice loud and trembling with self-righteous anger. "From the day you forced your way into this family, you have been nothing but a parasite. You could not hold on to a successful man, so you decided to brainwash my grandson and use him to ruin Greg's reputation today. You are a disgrace to this community." I looked at my former father-in-law, absorbing the full weight of his delusion. He believed Greg was the victim. He had convinced himself that my years of silent sacrifice were nothing but a manipulation tactic. "Greg ruined his own reputation, Richard," I replied, my tone perfectly measured. "He abandoned his son. He paraded his new wife around while refusing to pay child support. Caleb simply handed him the mirror." Patricia stepped forward, her face contorted into an ugly scowl. She placed a protective hand on Greg's shoulder, standing firmly beside her golden child. "You are an incredibly arrogant woman, Nina," she announced, her voice shrill and carrying across the hallway to ensure the lingering bystanders heard every single word. "We have been more than generous to that boy, and this is how he repays us? It ends now. I am calling our family attorney tomorrow morning. We are cutting Caleb out of the family will. He gets nothing." Richard puffed out his chest, standing taller as he delivered what he believed to be the ultimate fatal blow. He looked down at me with a triumphant, gloating expression, assuming he had finally found the leverage to crush my spirit. "And Greg is pulling Caleb's Ivy League tuition this afternoon," Richard gloated, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his aged face. "We are canceling the checks. Let us see how far your pathetic little accounting salary gets him when that massive tuition bill is due next month. You and that ungrateful boy are going to be drowning in debt for the rest of your miserable lives." They stood there, a united front of generational wealth and toxic entitlement waiting for me to break. They expected me to panic, to beg for forgiveness, to plead with them not to punish my brilliant son. They wanted to see me cry. They wanted me to apologize for daring to stand up to their precious family. But I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear, and I certainly did not apologize. Instead, I looked at Richard and Patricia, and I smiled. It was a calm, terrifying smile that contained absolute certainty. I saw Richard's triumphant expression falter slightly, a sudden flicker of doubt crossing his eyes as he realized my reaction was completely wrong. Maintaining eye contact with the man who had just threatened my son's future, I slowly unclasped the top of my leather purse and reached inside. My hand slid into the familiar fabric lining of my bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and car keys, moving directly to the thick, stiff envelope resting against the back seam. I gripped the heavy paper and pulled it out into the bright, artificial light of the hallway. It was a single document, folded neatly in thirds. The crisp white pages were bound by a heavy brass staple at the top corner and bore the unmistakable blue ink stamp of a certified bank official. I did not unfold it. I simply extended my arm and pressed the thick packet firmly against Richard's chest, right over his expensive silk tie. He reflexively brought his hands up to catch the document before it could drop to the polished floor. He looked down at the sealed paper and then back up at me, a confused scowl twisting his aged features. Patricia leaned in closer to her husband, trying to read the text visible through the semi-transparent back page. Greg stood completely frozen against the blue lockers, his previous arrogant bluster evaporating into a sudden, tense silence. He knew exactly what that blue bank stamp meant. "Read it out loud, Richard," I challenged. My voice did not rise above a conversational volume, but it carried a sharp, commanding edge that cut effortlessly through the hallway noise. "You are so absolutely certain about your son's financial generosity. You are so confident that he is the victim here today. Go ahead. Read the front page to your wife." Richard scoffed, adjusting his posture to project authority. He flipped the document over and snapped the pages open with a quick flick of his wrists. He expected to find some meaningless legal threat, or perhaps an old child support complaint that he could easily dismiss. Instead, his eyes scanned the prominent, bold lettering at the top of the official page. He opened his mouth to read the text aloud, just as I had demanded, but the words died in his throat. The indignant red flush that had colored his cheeks only moments ago vanished completely. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray. The paper began to tremble violently in his hands as his eyes darted back and forth across the detailed financial ledger. "What is it, Richard?" Patricia demanded. She reached out and snatched the document from his shaking fingers. She adjusted her reading glasses and scanned the summary paragraph. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The document was an official certified bank audit. It provided undeniable legal proof that the massive educational trust fund Richard himself had established for Caleb over a decade ago was entirely empty. The account balance read 0. The transaction history attached to the back pages detailed exactly how and when the money had disappeared. 3 years ago, when Caleb was a freshman, Greg submitted false certifications to the trust administrator, claiming the withdrawals were qualified educational expenses. Because you named him co-trustee Richard, he could authorize distributions without my signature. Caleb turned 18 last month and gave the bank written permission to release the complete history. Their compliance review traced every transfer. Over 4 months, Greg systematically emptied the account, routined the money through vendors that never provided Caleb a single service. The blue stamp confirms these are the bank's certified findings, not accusations I created for today. Greg pushed himself away from the lockers, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Dad, I can explain," he stammered, a frantic, desperate edge creeping into his voice. "It was a temporary loan. I was going to put the money back." "You were never going to put it back," I countered, stepping forward and closing the distance between us. The crowd of lingering parents had grown completely silent, watching the wealthy, powerful family self-destruct in the middle of the school corridor. "You used your own son's college money to finance your new life." I turned my attention back to the horrified grandparents, who were staring at their son in utter disbelief. "Your son took Caleb's future and used it to purchase Lexi's $90,000 luxury sport utility vehicle. The rest of the trust fund was completely drained to pay for their lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. The very same wedding where you both stood up and gave a toast to Greg's incredible financial success. Patricia looked like she was going to be physically sick. She stared at the bank statements documenting the massive withdrawals, dropping her gaze to the floor as the reality of her son's theft settled over her. The illusion of the successful corporate provider was permanently shattered. Greg was not a generous father. He was a thief who had stolen from his own child to fund a lifestyle he could not actually afford. The PTA mothers who had been listening to Lexi's hysterical sobbing mere feet away now stared at Greg with absolute, unmasked disgust. Richard lowered his shaking hands. The anger that he had directed at me just minutes ago shifted entirely. He turned slowly, his head snapping toward his son. The look in his eyes was lethal. The unbreakable alliance between the wealthy enablers and their golden child fractured instantly. "You stole from your own son," Richard whispered, his voice thick with a rage that was far more terrifying than his previous shouting. "I trusted you to manage that account, Greg. I built that fund so my grandson would never have to worry about tuition. And you bought a car with it." "Dad, please," Greg begged, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "The corporate merger is almost finalized. I will have a massive bonus by the end of the year. I will replace the funds before Caleb even enrolls." "The tuition bill is due next month," Richard roared the sudden volume, causing several people nearby to physically jump backward. "You told me you had it handled. You told me the checks were already written. You lied to my face for 3 years." Lexi stopped crying. She stood frozen against the tiled wall, her ruined makeup forgotten, as she realized that her luxury car and her dream wedding had been paid for with stolen money. She looked at Greg as if he were a complete stranger. The social humiliation was absolute and complete. She was no longer just the embarrassed stepmother. She was the woman who drove a car bought with stolen child support. I did not stay to watch the rest of the argument. My point had been made, and the truth was permanently out in the open. I felt a solid, reassuring presence step up close beside me. Caleb had quietly emerged from the crowd of graduates, his blue gown rustling softly as he moved to my right side. He looked at his father, his grandparents, and his stepmother. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet, profound acceptance of the reality he had always known. I turned away from the man who had tried to destroy us. I linked my arm firmly through Caleb's, and we turned our backs on the chaos. We walked down the long, brightly lit hallway toward the glass exit doors. Behind us, the shouting escalated. Richard's furious accusations and Patricia's shrill cries of betrayal echoed off the metal lockers. Greg's desperate, pathetic attempts to justify his theft were drowned out by his parents' absolute outrage. We pushed through the heavy doors and stepped outside, leaving the family screaming at each other. The afternoon sun hit our faces as we cleared the building. The air felt entirely different now, no longer heavy with Greg's expectations, but light with the promise of a genuine future. Caleb held his cap of shoulders, finally relaxed. The rigid posture he carried into the auditorium was gone. We walked to the car in silence, the echoes of his grandparents' shouting fading away. We refused to let their toxic unraveling ruin this milestone. I had made reservations months ago at L'Etoile, an exclusive 5-star restaurant downtown. Securing a table required immense corporate connections or persistent calling. I opted for the latter, determined to give Caleb a worthy celebration. The drive was peaceful. When we arrived, the maitre d' escorted us to a secluded booth near the back. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the gymnasium. Soft jazz played, and the scent of truffle oil wafted through the air. We ordered appetizers, and for the first time all day, Caleb genuinely smiled. He laughed about a joke, and we talked about his upcoming college orientation. We were midway through our first course when the quiet sanctuary of our booth was abruptly violated. For several minutes, the restaurant gave us the quiet celebration the school had denied us. Caleb tasted the truffle soup, made an exaggerated serious face, and declared that it cost more than every lunch he had eaten during senior year combined. I laughed so suddenly that the tension behind my ribs loosened. We had spent the day bracing for another attack, and nearly forgotten that this dinner belonged to us. Caleb set down his spoon. "I am sorry I changed the speech without warning you." "I am not," I said. "But I wish you had not needed to defend me on your graduation day." He looked toward the candle between us. "I needed to defend the truth. Dad has spent years acting like the college fund gives him permission to control me. Once I saw you at the doors, I realized I was still letting him use money that was not even there." I reached across the table and covered his hand. I had intended to tell him about the certified trust review after the ceremony, somewhere private, with time for him to process the theft. Instead, his father had forced the truth into public view. "The missing fund does not change your plans," I said. "Your enrollment deposit has cleared. Your first tuition payment is scheduled. Your housing is secure." Caleb studied me. "You already paid it?" I planned for the possibility that Greg's promises were worthless. His eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Mom, I do not want you sacrificing everything again." "I am not the woman earning dinner wages anymore," I told him. "I have savings, equity in my firm, and a college account that no one else can touch. Paying for your education will not cost me my home or my future. This time, support does not require suffering." He leaned back and released a breath. For most of his childhood, love and sacrifice had been inseparable. Now I wanted him to understand that stability could also be love. Caleb removed his phone and opened the family sharing application. "I am turning off Dad's access." He disabled location sharing, blocked Greg's number, and then frowned at the screen. "The tablet in my graduation bag is still connected. I left the bag with the coat check." I glanced toward the entrance. "We will collect it before dessert." Those remaining minutes of connection were enough for Greg to locate us. We returned to discussing orientation and roommates until movement near the host stand drew my attention. I actually saw them before Caleb. Greg and Lexi were weaving through the elegant tables. Lexi was stumbling slightly, her designer heels catching on the plush carpet. She had self-medicated her public humiliation using alcohol to fuel a desperate sense of entitlement. Greg marched behind her, scanning the room with frantic energy. He had tracked Caleb's location through a family sharing app I forgot to disable. But Greg was not here to apologize. His gaze suddenly locked onto a large table across the room. Sitting there was Arthur Harrison, the CEO of the investment firm Greg was desperately trying to merge with. The realization clicked instantly. Greg needed to secure a multi-million-dollar merger, and to do that, he had to project the illusion of a successful family. He could not afford rumors of his public meltdown reaching Harrison. He reached our table and forcefully pulled up an empty chair, dropping into it heavily, invading our space without hesitation. For Harrison's benefit, Greg plastered a fake, loving father smile across his face, leaning in close. But his eyes were dead, and his voice when he spoke was a harsh whisper pushed through gritted teeth. "You think you can embarrass me and walk away?" Greg hissed, maintaining his grotesque smile for the audience across the room. "You are going to sit here, smile, and play nice until Harrison leaves. If you cause a scene, I will bury you in legal fees for the rest of your life." Greg did not ask permission. He dragged an empty chair across the carpet, turning several heads. The maitre d' followed, explaining that our table was reserved for two. Greg ignored him and sat between our booth and the aisle, blocking the easiest path to the exit. Lexi remained standing. She had reapplied lipstick in the car, but the rest of her makeup still carried faint streaks from the hallway. She scanned the room before looking at either of us. When she noticed Harrison across the dining room, her shoulders straightened and her expression transformed into the bright social smile she used for photographs. "Arthur is here," she whispered to Greg. "I know," he answered without moving his lips. That explained the invasion. Greg had spent 6 months pursuing Harrison Capital. The proposed merger would provide bridge funding and make outside experts appear to validate his business. If Harrison walked away, lenders would ask questions before the week ended. Greg needed Harrison to see a united family, not an abandoned son and an ex-wife who knew the accounts. Greg placed one arm along the back of Caleb's booth as though posing for an informal family dinner. "Smile," he murmured. "Harrison is looking over here." Caleb moved away from his arm. "Do not touch me." The maitre d' cleared his throat. "Sir, unless the guests have invited you, I must ask you to return to your own reservation." Greg produced a folded bill and tried to press it into the man's hand. The maitre d' did not accept it. "We are family," Greg said. "There has been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," I replied. "They were not invited." Greg's smile remained fixed because Harrison had glanced toward us. Beneath the table, his knee bounced. "Nina, do not be foolish. One ugly scene can damage Caleb's reputation, too. Colleges reconsider students who attract scandal." Caleb stared at him. "Are you threatening my admission, now that the fake tuition threat failed?" A nearby server paused. Greg heard the question carry and whispered, "Sit here for 20 minutes. Let Harrison believe the ceremony was an emotional misunderstanding. Then we will resolve the financial issue privately." "You mean hide it until the merger closes?" I said. His smile tightened. "I mean act like an adult." Lexi slid into the remaining edge of the booth without permission. She arranged her handbag where the centerpiece had been and lifted her chin toward Harrison's table. "We should order something celebratory," she said. "People need to see that there are no hard feelings." The sentence sounded harmless, but her eyes had settled on the wine list, and a new plan was forming behind them. The room had become a stage for his lie. Before I could formulate a response to his threat, Lexi decided it was her turn to reclaim the spotlight. She swayed slightly as she braced her hands on the edge of our table, her eyes glittering with a toxic cocktail of alcohol and wounded pride. She was absolutely desperate to regain her sense of superiority. To prove she was still the untouchable trophy wife, she dramatically threw her hand up in the air, snapping her fingers aggressively to flag down the nearest sommelier. The elegant man approached immediately, his expression neutral, despite her boorish behavior. "We are celebrating!" Lexi announced, her voice unnaturally loud, purposefully cutting through the quiet ambiance. Several patrons at nearby tables turned to look. "I want your absolute best vintage. Bring us the Dom Perignon Rosé, the 2002 vintage." She paused, her lips curling into a vicious sneer as she looked directly at me. "And you can go ahead and put that $2,000 bottle right on her tab." The sommelier hesitated for a fraction of a second, his trained eyes darting between Lexi's flushed face and my calm demeanor. He was waiting for me to object to the exorbitant charge. Lexi leaned forward, her heavy perfume overpowering the delicate aroma of our food. This was her humiliation attempt, her way of putting me back in my place. The sommelier kept his professional expression, but he did not immediately write the order. "The 2002 Rosé is one of our limited cellar selections," he explained. "Once opened, the bottle cannot be returned. I will need confirmation from the guest responsible for the table." Lexi pointed directly at me. "She is responsible. This is her graduation dinner." "It was our dinner before you arrived," Caleb said. Two diners at the neighboring table exchanged glances. Lexi noticed and raised her voice another degree, determined to frame the confrontation before anyone else could. Nina insisted on celebrating independently so she can demonstrate how independent she really is. $2,000 should not be a problem for a successful accountant. I understood his plan. If I objected, he would pay for the bottle and transform himself into the generous provider who had rescued his struggling former wife. If I accepted and my card declined, Lexi would receive the public humiliation she had been denied at school. Either outcome allowed them to rewrite the afternoon before Harrison crossed the room. The sommelier turned to me. "Madame, shall I place the order?" I let the silence stretch. Lexi smiled, already imagining the story she would tell. Greg reached toward the inside pocket of his jacket, preparing the theatrical rescue. Across the room, Harrison glanced up again, attracted by the unusual volume at our table. "Before she answers," Caleb said, "you should know. My father has been threatening people with money that does not belong to him all day." Greg's hand stopped halfway to his wallet. "Enough." I rested my fingers on the wine list. The price did not frighten me, but their certainty revealed how completely they had ignored the last decade of my life. They still saw the exhausted junior clerk Greg had abandoned, not the partner whose signature authorized investigations worth millions. I decided the lesson should be unmistakable for the whole room. "Let us see if your pathetic little bookkeeping job can cover this," Lexi sneered, her voice dripping with absolute malice and condescension. "Since you are so fiercely independent now, Nina, since you think you do not need anyone's help," Greg let out a smirk. He leaned back in his stolen chair, crossing his arms. This was exactly how he operated. He assumed I would panic at the price tag. He expected me to flush with embarrassment, stammer, and admit that I could not afford such a luxury. In his mind, the trap was perfectly set. He would let me squirm for a few agonizing seconds, feeling my financial inadequacy, and then dramatically swoop in. He would pull out his own platinum card, pay the bill, and play the role of the generous provider. It would soothe his bruised ego and put on the perfect show of dominance for Mr. Harrison watching across the room. But I did not panic. I did not flush or avert my gaze. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the pathetic nature of their coordinated attack. I looked at Lexi, whose eyes were wide with malicious anticipation, and then at Greg, whose smug expression was already settling into place. They had spent the last 18 years drastically underestimating me, and they were about to pay the price. I calmly reached across the table and took the leather-bound wine list directly from Lexi's shaking hand. I turned my attention to the sommelier, who was still standing by the table shifting uncomfortably as he waited for instructions. I offered him a polite, reassuring smile, completely ignoring the toxic energy radiating from my ex-husband and his wife. "Actually," I said, my voice perfectly measured, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who holds all the cards. I reached into my designer handbag, my fingers bypassing my standard bank cards, and pulled out a sleek, solid metal, black card. It caught the dim light of the restaurant as I placed it firmly onto the sommelier's small silver tray. The heavy clink of the metal card against the silver tray echoed sharply, a definitive sound that shattered the arrogant silence at the table. "We will take the Dom Perignon Rosé," I instructed the sommelier, maintaining my calm, steady gaze. "But please make it 2 bottles, one for my son and me, to celebrate his incredible graduation, and one for my ex-husband and his wife. It seems they are in desperate need of a drink to soothe their nerves." The sommelier's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the exclusive, highly coveted metal card resting on his tray. He immediately gave a deep, respectful bow, murmuring his compliance before turning swiftly to fetch our order. I folded my hands neatly on the table and looked back at my uninvited guests. The transformation on their faces was absolutely glorious. The smug, triumphant smirk had been entirely wiped off Greg's face, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. His eyes were locked onto the space where the metal card had just been, his mind completely failing to process how his supposedly impoverished ex-wife had just casually dropped $4,000 without blinking. Lexi stood completely frozen in her tracks, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. Instead of exposing my weakness to the entire room, she had successfully given me the absolute perfect stage to demonstrate my undeniable financial dominance. And they were left staring at me in paralyzing confusion. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table as the sommelier walked away to fetch our champagne. Lexi was still staring at the empty silver tray, her mind failing completely at the sight of the metal card. Greg was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he tried to process how his narrative of my pathetic existence had just crumbled. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to demand an explanation or hurl another baseless threat, but I did not give him the opportunity. I leaned forward, closing the distance across the table, my posture radiating the absolute authority I had earned over the last 18 years. I looked directly into Greg's panicked eyes, refusing to let him look away. "You have spent over a decade telling everyone I am just a lowly bookkeeper working double shifts to barely scrape by," I said, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet restaurant. "You convinced yourself that because you left me with nothing, I amounted to nothing. You never bothered to check on my career because you were too busy building your own illusions." Greg swallowed hard, the red flush creeping back up his neck. "While you were out buying luxury cars with stolen money and funding your fake life," I continued my gaze, shifting briefly to Lexi, who shrank back under my stare. "I went back to school. I earned my master's degree while raising our son alone. I passed my certification exams in the top 1% of the state. I started at the very bottom of a forensic accounting firm, and I worked my way up by dismantling the financial lies of men exactly like you." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the table. "I am not a bookkeeper, Greg. I am the senior managing partner of the top forensic accounting firm in this entire state." Greg blinked his brain, completely failing to comprehend the magnitude of my position. The title alone carried a weight in the financial sector that far exceeded his own corporate standing. He tried to force a weak laugh. "You are lying," he stammered, looking around the restaurant, as if expecting someone to jump out and confirm this was a prank. "There is absolutely no way a partner at a firm like that would be sitting here dealing with this." Lexi was completely silent. Her previous drunken bravado entirely vanished. She realized she had just insulted the financial status of a woman who could buy and sell her entire lifestyle with a single signature. "I do not need you to believe me, Greg," I replied smoothly. "I just need you to understand that I have spent the last 10 years dissecting corporate fraud. I know how men like you hide money. I know the exact offshore accounts you use, the shell companies you set up, and the fake ledgers you create to pass corporate audits." The remaining color drained from Greg's face. The mention of offshore accounts struck a visible nerve. His eyes darted nervously across the room, landing inevitably on Arthur Harrison's table. Harrison was finishing his meal, chatting amiably with his associates, completely unaware of the absolute destruction about to take place mere yards away. Greg leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a frantic, pleading whisper. "Keep your voice down, Nina. Whatever you think you know, you are wrong. I am finalizing a massive merger tomorrow morning. Do not ruin this for me." I did not lower my voice. Instead, I raised my hand and caught the eye of the chief executive officer across the room. Mr. Harrison noticed my raised hand and squinted slightly. I offered him a warm, professional smile and gestured for him to join us. Harrison recognized Greg, his prospective business partner, and assumed he was being invited over for a friendly introduction. He wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, excused himself from his associates, and began walking toward our booth. Greg turned his head and saw Harrison approaching. Pure, unadulterated terror seized his features. He stood up halfway, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, clearly intending to intercept Harrison before he could reach the table. "Arthur!" Greg practically shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I am so sorry for the interruption. My former wife and I were just leaving. A family emergency just came up and we have to step outside immediately." Harrison stopped at the edge of our table, looking confused by Greg's frantic energy. He looked down at me, taking in my calm demeanor, and then glanced at Caleb, who was sitting quietly, watching his father implode. "A family emergency?" Harrison asked, his deep voice rumbling with authority. "Greg, you look terrible. Is everything all right here?" I did not give Greg the chance to spin another lie. I remained seated, projecting total confidence and control. "There is no emergency, Mr. Harrison," I said smoothly, extending my hand toward him. "Greg is just feeling a little overwhelmed by the graduation festivities today. Please join us for a moment." Harrison hesitated, but his curiosity clearly won out. He shook my hand, his grip firm and assessing. "Arthur Harrison," he introduced himself. "And you must be Nina. Greg has mentioned you." "I am sure he has," I replied, offering a polite but knowing smile. "Though I sincerely doubt he told you the truth about my profession." Greg was visibly shaking now. He reached out his hand, hovering over the table, silently begging me to stop. "Arthur, please," Greg stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "We really must be going. This is not the time or the place." "I disagree," I stated firmly, shifting my gaze back to Harrison. I reached down into my leather bag for the second time that afternoon. My fingers wrapped around a thick, heavy document file. I pulled it out and placed it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth. It was a dense stack of papers, secured in a thick, red-tabbed folder, the universal symbol for an urgent, high-priority financial audit within my firm. Greg stared at the red tab as if it were a live explosive. He knew exactly what it meant. Lexi finally seemed to grasp the danger, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked between her husband and the imposing executive standing over them. I pressed my fingertips against the top of the folder and slid it smoothly across the polished wood, stopping it right in front of Mr. Harrison. The older man looked down at the file, a frown creasing his brow. He recognized the official seal of my firm stamped across the front cover. It was a firm his own company frequently used to vet potential acquisitions. He looked back up at me, the friendly demeanor entirely replaced by sharp, calculating business instincts. "What is this, Nina?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping an octave. "This is exactly why you need to sit down, Arthur," I replied. I folded my hands together, resting them gently on the table edge. The loud restaurant noise faded completely into the background. I looked right up at the towering executive. "Mr. Harrison," I said with lethal clarity, "before you sign that merger with my former husband tomorrow, you might want to look at the offshore tax fraud he committed to fund his wife's lifestyle. I should know. My firm just completed the audit." Greg let out a choked, broken gasp as his entire corporate world finally ended. Arthur Harrison did not rush. He possessed the calculated patience of a man who had built a financial empire by reading the fine print. He slowly opened the heavy red cover of the audit file, his eyes dropping to the first page of the executive summary. The ambient noise of the five-star restaurant seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence radiating from our booth. I sat back and took a slow sip of my ice water, watching the absolute destruction of my former husband unfold in real time. Greg was practically vibrating with terror. A thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his hands gripped the edge of the white tablecloth so hard his knuckles were stark white. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but Harrison raised a single commanding finger without ever looking up from the documents. The gesture demanded absolute silence, and Greg snapped his mouth shut, swallowing hard. Lexi was staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. She looked at Greg, her eyes wide, with a sudden, dawning panic. She might not have understood the complexities of corporate finance, but she understood the universal language of wealthy men in crisis. She could see that the man across the table held their entire lavish lifestyle in his hands, and those hands were currently turning the pages of an official forensic audit. Harrison turned to the second page. His thick, silver eyebrows drew together into a deep, intimidating frown. The atmosphere around the table dropped below freezing. The documents inside that folder were not vague accusations or angry theories. They were indisputable, verified financial proofs. My team had spent weeks tracing the money, following the digital breadcrumbs Greg had carelessly left behind. The audit detailed exactly how he had been systematically embezzling funds from his own company for the past 4 years. It showed the fake vendor invoices he had generated to siphon cash into offshore accounts. It highlighted the fraudulent expense reports he had used to hide his massive personal debts. He had stolen millions from his own business partners just to keep up the appearance of immense wealth, all to fund the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the expensive vacations Lexi demanded. Harrison spent 2 full minutes reading the summary and scanning the attached bank statements. For Greg, those 2 minutes must have felt like 2 agonizing lifetimes. Finally, the older executive closed the red folder. The heavy thud of the cardboard cover hitting the table sounded like a gavel coming down in a silent courtroom. Harrison did not yell. He did not lose his temper or cause a scene. His face was stone cold, completely devoid of the friendly warmth he had displayed just moments ago. He looked at Greg not as a prospective business partner, but as a dangerous liability that needed to be immediately neutralized. "You submitted your final financial disclosures to my firm last Tuesday, Greg," Harrison said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You signed documents legally affirming that your company was solvent, debt-free, and operating with complete financial integrity. You looked me in the eye and shook my hand." Greg leaned forward, his voice a desperate, high-pitched whine. "Arthur, please, listen to me. I can explain all of those transfers. It is a misunderstanding. It is just a temporary cash flow strategy. The money is going to be replaced the moment our merger goes through. I swear to you, the company is perfectly fine." "Do not insult my intelligence," Harrison replied, his tone laced with absolute disgust. He tapped his index finger against the firm seal stamped on the front of the audit. "I know this accounting firm. I know their reputation. They do not issue red-tabbed audits based on simple misunderstandings. They issue them when they find criminal fraud. You have been stealing from your own partners to finance your personal life." Harrison stood up slowly, towering over the booth. He buttoned his suit jacket, his movements precise and dismissive. "Consider our proposed merger completely dead, effective immediately," Harrison stated, delivering the fatal blow with ruthless efficiency. "My firm is pulling all capital investments from your company. We are canceling the bridge loans. I am calling my legal team the moment I step outside this restaurant. They will be contacting the federal authorities and the Securities and Exchange Commission tomorrow morning to report this fraud. I suggest you find yourself a very good criminal defense attorney, Greg. You are going to need one." Harrison did not look at Greg again. He turned his attention to me, offering a stiff but respectful nod of his head. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Nina. You just saved my firm a multi-million-dollar disaster." "You are very welcome, Mr. Harrison," I replied smoothly. "Have a wonderful evening." Harrison turned on his heel and walked briskly away from the table, leaving the restaurant without a backward glance. He did not return to his associates. He walked straight out the front doors to make the phone calls that would officially end Greg's career. Greg collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. His chest heaved as he began hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into his lungs. His hands trembled violently in his lap. The arrogant, wealthy corporate titan who had bullied me in the high school hallway was gone. His entire empire, his reputation, and his future had been completely dismantled in exactly 3 minutes. The facade of the powerful provider was shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Lexi sat frozen next to him, her heavily made-up face pale with shock. The alcohol-fueled bravado that had driven her to order a $2,000 bottle of champagne was completely eradicated. She looked at the red folder on the table, then at her hyperventilating husband, her mind rapidly connecting the dots. The offshore accounts were frozen. The merger was dead. The federal authorities were being notified. The money was gone. Her reaction was instantaneous and entirely self-serving. The illusion of their happy, blended family vanished. Lexi immediately went on the defensive, her survival instincts kicking in, as she realized the golden goose was actually a criminal facing federal prison. She turned on Greg with a vicious, terrifying speed, her voice rising in panic and fury. "You told me we were rich!" Lexi shrieked, no longer caring who in the restaurant heard her. "You told me the business was making millions. You bought me that car and told me it was a bonus. You lied to me. You made me look like a fool. I am driving a stolen vehicle. I am wearing stolen jewelry. Are the feds going to come after me?" Greg clutched his chest, shaking his head frantically. "Lexi, baby, calm down. Please, just calm down. We can fix this. I will call my lawyers. We can hide the assets." "There are no assets to hide, Greg," I pointed out calmly, my steady voice cutting through his pathetic attempt to soothe her. "The official legal audit has already been strictly filed with the appropriate regulatory agencies. Every single corporate account is currently flagged. The banks will completely freeze your assets by tomorrow morning. Your massive house, your expensive sports cars, your lavish luxury vacations, they are all gone. Forever. You have absolutely nothing left to your own name in this entire wide world." Lexi stared at me, the blood draining from her contoured face as the absolute reality of that statement took root. The massive, custom-built house in the gated community, the expansive closets filled with imported designer labels, the country club memberships, and the endless stream of luxury tropical vacations were all evaporating right before her eyes. For a woman whose entire identity, social standing, and self-worth were tied to her financial status, this was not just a minor setback. It was a complete annihilation of her existence. She slowly turned her head to look at the man sitting next to her, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The devoted superior wife act that she had worn like a protective shield for the past 5 years vanished in a single breath. The affectionate touches, the gentle laughs, and the adoring gazes she had manufactured for Arthur Harrison's benefit melted away, leaving behind a cold fury. She looked at Greg, not as her loving husband, but as a defective ATM machine that had just swallowed her card and closed its doors permanently. "You have absolutely nothing," Lexi repeated, her voice rising steadily from a frantic whisper into a sharp shriek that cut effortlessly through the soft jazz playing overhead. "You absolute fraud! You lied to me every single day since we met. You told me you were a massive success. You told me you were building an unstoppable corporate empire. You are nothing but a pathetic, broke loser who had to steal from a child just to buy me a handbag." Greg flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck. The public social humiliation he feared above all else was unfolding in real time in the middle of the most exclusive dining room in the city. The wealthy patrons seated at the surrounding velvet tables had entirely abandoned their meals, turning unapologetically in their chairs to witness the spectacular implosion of our table. Greg's chest heaved erratically as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. his face flushed with a mixture of pure terror and profound embarrassment. He was hyperventilating, his expensive suit jacket clinging to his sweating frame. "Lexi, please keep your voice down," Greg pleaded, his shaking hands reaching out across the white tablecloth to grab her wrists in a desperate attempt to contain her escalating physical outburst. "People are watching us. Everyone in the room is staring at you. Please, just stop talking. We can talk about all of this in the car. We can fix this if we just stay calm and leave quietly." It was a pathetic, transparent mirror image of his cowardly behavior back at the high school auditorium. Even now, with his entire career ending and his freedom hanging in the balance, his primary concern was maintaining the fragile illusion of control in front of an audience of complete strangers. But he was no longer the arrogant corporate titan orchestrating the room with his deep voice and expensive watch. He was a drowning man, gasping for his last breath of air, and Lexi had absolutely no intention of throwing him a life preserver. She violently slapped his reaching hands away, her diamond rings catching the dim light of the restaurant. "Do not ever touch me again!" she screamed, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings and silencing the entire dining area. "You do not get to tell me to be quiet anymore. You dragged me into a federal criminal investigation without my permission. You made me an unwitting accessory to your pathetic little corporate embezzlement scheme. Everyone in our social circle is going to know that you are a complete fake. You are going to a federal prison, Gregan, and you are going to leave me here with absolutely nothing to my name." Greg shrank back into his upholstered chair, his broad shoulders collapsing inward as the relentless onslaught of her verbal abuse battered him into submission. He looked wildly around the quiet restaurant, his panicked eyes darting from the shocked faces of the hovering waitstaff to the disgusted glares of the other diners who were judging his downfall. The head maitre d' was already speaking urgently into a small radio near the front entrance podium, calling for building security to escort them off the premises. Greg opened his mouth, trying desperately to formulate a coherent sentence, a logical defense, or even a simple plea for mercy from the woman he had ruined his life to impress. But no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the crushing realization that he could no longer buy charm or bully his way out of this impossible situation. The money was completely gone, and with it went the only leverage he ever possessed over the woman sitting right beside him. Lexi stood up abruptly, her heavy chair scraping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. She grabbed her designer leather purse, clutching it tightly against her chest like a physical shield against the incoming poverty. She looked down at Greg with a potent mixture of deep revulsion and frantic panic, her mind clearly racing through the severe legal implications of the audit I had just placed on the table. She realized in that exact moment that screaming at a broke, soon-to-be convicted felon would not save her from the federal authorities, the impending bank asset freeze, or the permanent loss of her elite status. She desperately needed a lifeline. She needed someone with undeniable power, unquestionable credibility, and most importantly, financial stability. Slowly, she turned her frantic gaze away from the ruined, hyperventilating man beside her and locked her eyes directly with mine. The rapid, emotional transformation that occurred over her features was terrifying to witness. The vicious, snarling anger she had just directed at Greg evaporated instantly, scrubbed from her face. In its place, she plastered on an expression of deep, tragic vulnerability. Her glossy lower lip began to tremble perfectly on cue. Heavy tears pooled in her wide eyes, threatening to spill over her dramatic eyelashes and ruin her applied makeup. The aggressive, entitled posture of a woman who had just minutes ago tried to humiliate me with a $2,000 champagne tab was entirely replaced by the shrinking, helpless demeanor of a victim desperately seeking salvation from the one person she had spent years tormenting. She placed her shaking hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth, leaning her body toward me across the wide divide, completely ignoring the fact that my son was sitting quietly beside me, watching her calculated performance unfold. She was banking on the desperate hope that I would feel some sort of misguided female solidarity, that I would pity her sudden fall from grace, and use my considerable professional influence to shield her from the devastating federal fallout that was about to hit their household. "He lied to me too, Nina," Lexi pleaded, her voice cracking with a masterfully executed, breathless sob that was designed to elicit immediate sympathy. The toxic vitriol was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading urgency. "You have to believe me. I had absolutely no idea about the stolen money. I never would have let him touch Caleb's educational trust fund if I had known the truth. I thought he was just incredibly successful at his job. I truly thought he was providing for us the right way. He manipulated my total trust. He used my naivety against me. I am a victim of his manipulation just like you." I stared at her tear-streaked face for a long moment. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost impressive. She had spent 5 years tormenting me, flaunting the wealth she thought her husband had rightfully earned, and treating my son as an inconvenient afterthought. Now faced with the absolute destruction of her carefully curated reality, she expected me to offer solidarity. She actually believed I would look at the woman who had just tried to humiliate me with a $2,000 bar tab and see a kindred spirit. She truly thought a few fake tears could magically erase years of calculated malice and intentional disrespect. A sound escaped my throat. It started as a sharp exhalation of breath and quickly blossomed into a laugh. It was a genuine, unbothered laugh that echoed through the silent dining room. I sat back against the plush leather of the booth, shaking my head as the amusement rippled through my chest. The look of profound confusion that washed over Lexi's face was absolutely priceless. Her bottom lip stopped trembling, and her tear-filled eyes widened in pure shock. She had expected me to show anger, offer pity, or perhaps deliver a harsh lecture on morality. She had certainly not expected me to find her sudden desperation so incredibly hilarious. Greg looked like he was going to be violently sick. He knew me well enough to understand that I never laughed unless I held the absolute winning hand. His panicked eyes darted nervously to my black leather handbag, sitting innocently on the cushioned seat right beside me. He visibly braced his entire body for whatever devastating financial explosive I was about to calmly detonate next. I reached into the bag, and my fingers bypassed my wallet and the space where the audit folder had been. I felt the crisp, sharp edge of a single folded document. I pulled it out and held it up to the ambient light of the restaurant. It was not printed on the heavy official paper of my accounting firm. It was a standard, high-quality copy of an international financial filing. I smoothed the center crease and placed it flat onto the white tablecloth, setting it right next to the empty space where the red-tabbed folder had rested before Mr. Harrison carried it away. Lexi stared down at the paper, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She wiped a stray tear away from her cheek, careful not to smudge her expensive mascara, and leaned slightly forward to read the bold heading printed at the very top of the page. It was an official incorporation document for a highly secretive shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. "Nice try, Lexi," I said, my voice dropping the amusement and settling into a cold, lethal clarity. I pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the document and pushed it firmly across the wide table until it touched her trembling hands. "But your signature is on the wire transfers as the primary beneficiary. You aren't the victim. You're the co-conspirator, and the IRS hates co-conspirators." The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Lexi went completely rigid. The remaining color drained from her face so fast she looked like a fragile porcelain doll. Her wide eyes locked onto the signature line located at the bottom of the page. It was her own, looping, dramatic handwriting staring back at her. Greg had convinced her to sign the incorporation papers under the guise of an executive title, deliberately stroking her fragile ego by making her the primary beneficiary of the offshore accounts. He had told her it was simply a standard tax strategy for wealthy corporate executives. She had signed her name on the dotted line without ever reading the fine print or questioning the source of the millions being transferred into her exclusive control. She slowly looked up at Greg, her mouth opening in a silent, horrified scream. He could not even bring himself to meet her frantic gaze. He stared down at his empty plate, his broad shoulders shaking as he continued to hyperventilate. He had set her up to take the fall right alongside him, and she finally realized the inescapable, terrifying depth of his ultimate betrayal. The golden parachute she thought she was securing for herself had just turned into a massive iron anchor that was going to drag her straight down to a federal penitentiary. The manufactured tears of sympathy completely vanished, replaced immediately by tears of genuine, unadulterated terror. She burst into loud, jagged sobs, desperately covering her face with her hands as the dark reality of her impending incarceration crushed her spirit. Her carefully constructed high society life was officially over. There would be no more exclusive country club lunches, no more extravagant designer shopping sprees, and absolutely no way to charm her way out of federal tax evasion charges. She was going to lose everything she valued, including her very freedom. I watched them implode for exactly 10 seconds before deciding that the pathetic show was officially over. I had delivered the harsh consequences they had spent the last decade earning, and I had absolutely no desire to witness the messy aftermath. I turned my attention away from the ruined couple and looked up just as the sommelier approached our table. He was carrying a polished silver ice bucket, holding the 2 beautiful bottles of vintage Dom Perignon rosé I had previously ordered. He moved toward us with hesitant, measured steps, clearly unsure how to navigate the active disaster zone our dinner table had suddenly become. He glanced nervously at Lexi, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her trembling hands, and then over at Greg, who looked like he was about to pass out from a severe lack of oxygen. I offered the cautious sommelier a warm, reassuring smile. I stood up slowly from the leather booth, deliberately smoothing the skirt of my simple navy blue dress. I reached into my handbag one final time and pulled out my leather wallet. I retrieved 5 crisp $100 bills and folded them neatly together. "Thank you for your truly excellent service this afternoon," I said, handing the generous cash tip directly to the bewildered sommelier. "My son and I will take our bottle of champagne to go. Please leave the other bottle right here for these 2. They are going to need a strong drink while they sit and wait for their criminal defense attorneys to call." The sommelier blinked repeatedly, his eyes darting quickly from the large stack of cash in his hand to my perfectly calm expression. "And the dinner bill, madam?" he asked quietly, visibly eager to finalize the uncomfortable transaction and step away from the unfolding chaos. "You can leave the complete remaining tabs squarely on my former husband's credit cards," I instructed smoothly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. "Though I highly recommend you run the transaction immediately. I suspect his accounts will be completely frozen by federal regulators within the hour." Greg let out another choked gasp, but he did not look up. He did not protest or demand that I pay my share. He was completely defeated. I offered my arm to Caleb. He stood tall, holding our champagne and wrapping his arm around my shoulders. We turned our backs on them and walked directly toward the exit. A slow clap started quickly swelling into a massive standing ovation from the entire restaurant staff as we proudly departed. Exactly 1 month passed since the evening we walked out of that restaurant. The fallout from the audit was rapid, absolute, and merciless in its execution. Arthur Harrison had not made empty threats when he walked away from our table. By the time the sun rose the very next morning, his elite legal team had already contacted the federal authorities and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The massive corporate merger that Greg had staked his entire future on was officially pronounced dead before the business day even began. News of the sudden cancellation spread through the financial district like a wildfire, consuming dry brush. Panic immediately seized the other investors, who had foolishly trusted my former husband with their money. They all withdrew their capital. Every single firm that had previously backed his ventures initiated immediate withdrawal procedures. The carefully constructed house of cards Greg spent the last decade building collapsed entirely within a matter of hours. Without the fresh infusion of cash from the Harrison merger, his company could not cover its massive operating debts. The embezzlement had drained the corporate accounts dry, leaving nothing but fabricated ledgers and empty promises. Employees arrived at the downtown office building only to find the doors securely padlocked and federal agents standing guard in the main lobby. Boxes of physical documents and dozens of computer hard drives were confiscated as evidence. Greg was no longer a respected corporate leader giving orders from a comfortable corner office suite. He faced absolute, total ruin. 2 days after the restaurant confrontation, the authorities formally moved against him. Federal marshals arrived at the massive gated property just as the sun began to set. Neighbors who had once envied their lavish lifestyle stood on perfectly manicured lawns and watched the spectacle unfold. Greg was escorted out the front door, wearing silver handcuffs, his head bowed in profound shame. The local news stations broadcast the dramatic arrest during their evening segments, ensuring everyone in the city witnessed his spectacular downfall. He was formally federally indicted for multiple counts of corporate fraud, tax evasion, and grand theft. The man who had mocked my modest life was now sitting in a cold concrete holding cell without bail. He had absolutely no chance of escaping justice. While Greg sat behind iron bars facing decades in prison, Lexi experienced her own personalized version of hell. Her primary survival strategy had always been to align herself with immense wealth, but that wealth was now toxic. In a desperate, frantic attempt to sever ties and save herself from the sinking ship, she quickly filed for divorce. She hired the most aggressive family law attorney she could find on credit, hoping to extract spousal support or a large financial settlement before the remaining money evaporated. She thought she could simply walk away and paint herself as an innocent victim who had been deceived. She was entirely wrong. Her attorney delivered the grim reality during their very first official meeting. She could not escape the law. Because her signature was prominently featured on the Cayman Islands incorporation documents, she was legally implicated in the massive embezzlement scheme. The federal government did not care that she had signed the papers without reading them. They saw a willing conspirator who had directly benefited from stolen corporate funds. Within days of his arrest, the government took decisive action against her. Every single bank account tied to her name was frozen completely solid. Her exclusive credit cards were immediately declined when she attempted to purchase a coffee at a local cafe. She had absolutely no access to the millions she had grown accustomed to spending without a second thought. The illusion of her endless wealth vanished into thin air. She was now completely ruined financially. The material consequences followed quickly. A team of federal agents descended upon the custom house she loved so much. Armed with a strict seizure warrant, they meticulously cataloged and confiscated everything of value purchased with the stolen money. Lexi watched in stunned silence as strangers carried out her expansive collection of imported designer handbags, her diamond jewelry, and her expensive furs. The luxury sports cars parked in the wide driveway were loaded onto flatbed tow trucks and hauled away. She was not allowed to keep anything that could be traced back to the offshore accounts. In less than 2 full days, she was entirely stripped of the superficial armor that had defined her arrogant personality for the last 5 years. She had absolutely nothing left. Once the physical assets were gone, her social demise began. The elite country club where she had spent countless afternoons gossiping and sipping champagne officially revoked her membership due to non-payment. The women she considered her closest friends suddenly refused to answer her desperate phone calls or reply to her frantic text messages. The affluent society circles she had ruthlessly clawed her way into instantly shunned her. They viewed her not as a tragic victim of circumstance, but as a dangerous pariah contaminated by a massive federal scandal. She was no longer invited to charity galas, exclusive luncheons, or lavish weekend parties. Lexi realized that their loyalty was entirely conditional on the fraudulent money she no longer possessed. She became a total outcast very quickly. With her bank accounts completely frozen and her social network entirely evaporated, Lexi could not maintain the massive mortgage payments on the empty house. The bank formally served an eviction notice just 3 weeks after his humiliating arrest. She had to pack her few remaining personal items into cheap cardboard boxes she salvaged from a local grocery store. Stripped of her extravagant status and facing mounting legal bills to defend herself against the federal conspiracy charges, she had only one pathetic option left available. She was forced to pack up her entire ruined life and quietly move back into her parents' cramped, unfinished basement, located in a modest working-class neighborhood she had previously sworn she would never return to. Her spectacular downfall was complete. The psychological toll of living in that cramped basement crushed whatever remained of her pride. Every morning she woke up surrounded by exposed pipes and cold concrete walls, a stark contrast to the sprawling mansion she had lost. She spent her days aggressively refreshing news websites, reading the highly publicized updates regarding her impending divorce and the ongoing federal investigation. Online commentators relentlessly mocked her dramatic plunge from high society. The same local blogs that had once photographed her at exclusive charity events now published unflattering articles detailing her financial ruin. Lexi was utterly trapped in a small, damp space, suffocating under the heavy weight of massive legal debt and the terrifying prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence. She had absolutely nowhere to run. As for myself, the month passed with a quiet, fulfilling sense of profound peace. Caleb and I did not celebrate their destruction, but we deeply enjoyed the calm stability that finally settled over our lives. He thrived during his final weeks of high school, completely unburdened by the toxic demands of his father. My accounting firm continued to expand its operations, successfully securing several new major corporate clients. The deep wounds of the past decade were officially closed, healed by the undeniably sweet justice of natural consequences. I never once looked back at the wreckage Greg and Lexi created for themselves. We simply moved forward into our bright future, leaving them buried entirely in their own inescapable darkness. Our wonderful lives were finally our own. The swift and brutal justice that dismantled Greg and Lexi did not stop at their doorstep. It extended its heavy reach to the very people who had spent decades meticulously cultivating Greg's toxic entitlement. Richard and Patricia, his endlessly enabling parents, had always believed their son could do no wrong. They had funded his early ventures, excused his marital infidelities, and actively participated in the relentless harassment against me following the graduation ceremony. They felt invincible sitting in their sprawling historic estate overlooking the valley, a property that had been the crown jewel of their social standing for over 30 years. But their blind devotion to their golden child contained a fatal financial flaw. In his frantic attempts to secure bridge capital before the Harrison merger, Greg had convinced his parents to legally co-sign several massive corporate loans. They had signed the binding documents without a second thought, completely trusting his fabricated ledger. When the federal authorities froze Greg's accounts and the banks realized the primary business assets were entirely fraudulent, the aggressive collection agencies immediately turned their sights on the co-signers. The financial ruin that struck Richard and Patricia was absolute and terrifyingly fast. The local banks placed multiple heavy liens against their historic estate. Richard attempted to leverage his remaining social connections to secure emergency loans, but the affluent community had already read the damning headlines detailing his son's federal indictment. The same wealthy friends who had attended their lavish summer garden parties suddenly refused to answer Richard's desperate phone calls. Patricia was removed from the board of her prestigious charity foundation by a unanimous, silent vote. Facing the terrifying reality of Greg's mounting legal defense fees and the aggressive bank foreclosure process, Richard and Patricia had no alternative left. They were forced to list their beloved sprawling estate on the public market for a rapid emergency cash sale. Because they needed the capital immediately to prevent their son from spending the trial in a federal holding facility, they had to accept an insulting offer that was millions below the actual market value. The closing process was a spectacular public humiliation. Moving trucks lined their long driveway for days as estate liquidators carried out generations of accumulated luxury items, antique furniture, and expensive artwork to cover the remaining debt margins. Neighbors they had once looked down upon stood on their sidewalks and watched the tragic spectacle unfold. Richard and Patricia were forced to relocate into a small, nondescript rental condominium on the outskirts of the city, far away from the affluent neighborhoods they had dominated for decades. The stress of the situation aged them both overnight. Richard lost his commanding posture, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his son's monumental failure and the evaporation of his own life savings. Patricia could no longer show her face at the local grocery store without encountering the judging whispers of women she used to casually dismiss. They had sacrificed their entire pristine legacy, their vast fortune, and their comfortable retirement simply to pay a team of ruthless defense attorneys who explicitly warned them that Greg would still likely serve significant prison time. Their blind loyalty had cost them absolutely everything, leaving them completely isolated in their twilight years, with nothing but the bitter consequences of their own enabling behavior. They had built a monster, and that monster had ultimately turned around and consumed them whole. While Greg's entire extended family collapsed under the suffocating weight of federal indictments and public disgrace, the atmosphere inside our home was a portrait of profound serenity. The stark contrast between their frantic destruction and our quiet stability was undeniable. I sat at my kitchen island early one Saturday morning, sipping a warm cup of coffee and watching the golden sunlight filter softly through the window panes. The house was peaceful, filled with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds singing in the backyard oak tree. There were no collection agencies calling our phone lines, no federal agents knocking on our front door, and no desperate lies required to maintain our daily existence. My accounting firm was experiencing a period of unprecedented growth, but the financial success was secondary to the deep, unshakable sense of security that now permeated every single aspect of our lives. I had built this sanctuary through years of honest, relentless hard work, and absolutely no one could ever take it away from us. We were finally safe. Upstairs, the rhythmic sound of packing tape being pulled from a dispenser echoed down the hallway. Caleb was preparing for his monumental move to the East Coast. He had officially accepted admission to a prestigious Ivy League university, earning a modest merit award, while I paid the remaining tuition and housing costs. He did not need the empty promises of a non-existent trust fund, and he certainly did not need the tainted money his father had stolen from innocent investors. Caleb had earned his bright future entirely on his own merit, his brilliant mind, and his unwavering dedication. I walked up the wooden stairs and leaned quietly against his bedroom doorframe, watching my son carefully fold his clothes and place his favorite books into sturdy cardboard boxes. He looked up and offered me a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The heavy burden of his father's toxic expectations was entirely gone from his broad shoulders. He was stepping into adulthood as a grounded, compassionate, and fiercely intelligent young man. True wealth was not measured in offshore accounts, imported sports cars, or forced social status. True wealth was sitting right here in this room, completely unburdened by lies. I stepped into his room and wrapped my arms around him, holding him in a long, quiet embrace. We had successfully survived the massive storm they had tried to drown us in. As Caleb finalized his packing, I looked out the open bedroom window at the bright, clear morning sky. Our beautiful new life was waiting just for us. The late August air in New England carried a crisp, promising chill that completely cut through the lingering summer humidity. We carried the last heavy cardboard box up the 3 flights of worn wooden stairs of the historic brick dormitory building. The campus outside the arched windows was a breathtaking portrait of academic prestige, with sprawling green lawns, towering oak trees, and centuries-old stone architecture that seemed to radiate a quiet, undeniable authority. Caleb dropped the box onto the center of his new twin bed with a heavy sigh of relief, wiping a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. He looked around the modest, brightly lit space that would serve as his home for the next 4 years. It was a simple room, with scuffed hardwood floors and 2 sturdy desks, but to us, it looked like an absolute palace. It represented the ultimate culmination of a decade of silent, relentless dedication. I walked over to the open window and let the cool autumn breeze wash over my face, listening to the excited chatter of other students and parents moving into the surrounding buildings. There was a profound lightness in my chest. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had once defined my existence during my marriage to Greg was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, enduring sense of peace. I watched Caleb open the final box and carefully pull out his favorite framed photographs, arranging them neatly on the shelf above his assigned desk. Every item in this room, from the soft cotton bed sheets to the expensive calculus textbooks stacked on the chair, had been completely paid for. The astronomical Ivy League tuition had been covered in full, in cash, before we even packed the car to drive up the coast. I did not need to rely on the empty, fraudulent promises of a non-existent educational trust fund. I did not have to beg a man who despised me for financial support. And I certainly did not have to worry about federal authorities knocking on our door to seize stolen corporate assets. The money that secured my son's future was remarkably clean. It was the direct result of years of meticulous accounting, late nights reviewing endless tax ledgers, and building a legitimate, highly respected professional firm from the ground up. It was honest money earned through undeniable merit and sheer perseverance, and it provided a foundation that absolutely no one could ever shatter. Caleb smoothed the edge of his quilt and sat down on the edge of the mattress, looking around the organized room with a genuine, relaxed smile. He possessed a rare maturity for an 18-year-old boy, a deep emotional intelligence forged in the fires of watching his father's toxic narcissism completely unravel. He had witnessed the darkest, most manipulative sides of human nature, and instead of allowing it to make him bitter or cruel, he had chosen to become compassionate, grounded, and fiercely independent. He looked up from his folded hands and met my gaze across the small dormitory room. The profound admiration shining in his dark eyes was so intense that it actually made my breath catch in my throat for a brief second. "You really let them dig their own graves, didn't you?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice carrying a rich mixture of awe and deep understanding. I turned away from the window and leaned my shoulder against the sturdy wooden doorframe, considering his perceptive question. He understood exactly what had happened. He knew that I had never actively plotted to destroy Greg or Lexi. I had never engaged in malicious sabotage, planted false evidence, or spread vicious rumors to ruin their reputations. Their spectacular, highly publicized downfall was entirely of their own making. I had simply stepped back, removed myself as their convenient scapegoat, and allowed the natural, inevitable consequences of their own staggering arrogance to finally catch up with them. They had built a fragile, glittering empire entirely on a foundation of lies, theft, and profound entitlement. All I had done was supply the federal auditors with the absolute truth. I simply smiled at my son, a warm, genuine expression that reached all the way to my eyes. I did not need to offer a lengthy explanation or a triumphant speech about justice. The quiet reality of this beautiful room, the paid tuition receipt sitting in my leather handbag, and the bright, secure future stretching out before him were the only answers required. I walked over and wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him into a tight, lingering embrace. He hugged me back just as fiercely, resting his chin on the top of my head. In that silent, perfect moment, the last remaining shadows of our past completely dissolved into nothingness. We finished organizing his desk supplies, laughing together as we tried to figure out the complex instructions for his new desk lamp. The mundane, ordinary task felt incredibly sacred. We were building a brand new life, step by step, entirely on our own terms. When the room was finally perfect, I grabbed my empty purse and prepared for the long drive back to my own quiet, peaceful home. I paused at the heavy wooden door, taking one final lingering look at my brilliant son standing confidently in his Ivy League dorm room. As I walked down the historic brick pathway toward the visitor parking lot, the afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the vibrant green campus lawn. I felt a profound, empowering realization wash over my entire being, settling deep into my bones. You never have to scream to prove your worth. You never have to match the chaotic, desperate volume of those who try to break you down. True power is remarkably silent. It is deeply patient. It does not demand immediate attention or seek empty validation from a crowd. It simply waits quietly, building strength and undeniable competence in the shadows, and it strikes precisely when the arrogant forget exactly who they are dealing with. The journey from being the family scapegoat to reclaiming your power teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth and resilience. When the people who are supposed to protect and nurture you instead choose to belittle, manipulate, or cast you aside, the instinct is often to fight back, loudly, demanding the love and respect you inherently deserve. However, true empowerment does not come from forcing others to see your value. It comes from recognizing it yourself. The most devastating response to toxic entitlement and arrogance is silent, focused growth. While others expend their energy maintaining facades, playing favorites, or tearing you down to inflate their own egos, you must quietly build your sanctuary. Cultivate your hidden strengths, whether that is financial independence, a flourishing career, unshakable mental fortitude, or a supportive chosen family. Let the noise of their doubt fuel your quiet dedication. When the moment of reckoning inevitably arrives, you do not need to scream to prove your worth. You simply present the undeniable truth of your success and your unyielding boundaries. Justice in these situations rarely looks like a dramatic, theatrical revenge. Instead, it is the immovable reality of your independence. It is watching their fragile, fabricated worlds collapse under the weight of their own greed and lies, while you stand securely on the foundation you built with your own hands. You learn that walking away from conditional love is not a failure, but the ultimate victory. Share your own stories of overcoming difficult family dynamics and reclaiming your independence in the comments below. If you found value in this lesson of resilience and quiet power, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more empowering content. Remember, your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to